Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I used to see him nearly every morning, always standing near the corner of Foster and 8th, where the city met the quieter, more residential streets. He never begged, never moved, just stood there in the same worn-out gray coat, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against a cold only he could feel. At first I didn't pay him much mind. It's a city, people exist in their own worlds. But after a few weeks, I started to notice him. His face was lean, hollow, like someone who had either given up or been worn down by something much larger than himself. His dark eyes didn't dart around like most people in his situation. They stayed locked on one point: the entrance to my office building. I tried not to dwell on it. I'd remind myself that cities were full of forgotten people, those who had simply slipped through the cracks of life. It wasn't my place to judge or interfere. But that didn't explain the feeling. The one that started creeping in after a month or so. The sense that he wasn't just standing there, that he was waiting. I was never the kind of person to fixate on things. I had my routine, my job, my small, predictable life, and I liked it that way. I wasn't the guy who noticed strangers, or who let his mind wander into places it didn't belong. Maybe that's why it took me so long to put the pieces together. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where nothing ever really changed. My father was a quiet man, an observer. He wasn't warm, not in the way my mother was. He didn't fill the house with laughter or soft reassurances, but he was constant, reliable in his own way. He worked hard, but never spoke much about his job. As a kid, I thought nothing of it. Parents go to work, they come home. That was life. My mother was the opposite of him, vibrant, full of life, someone who left a room feeling lighter than when she'd entered it. She balanced him out. For the most part, we were normal. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Until we weren't. Until the day he left. I was 17, old enough to understand that something was wrong, but not old enough to know how to fix it. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no long, painful speeches about broken love or resentment. One day he just left, walked out the door, and never came back. The police took the report. They asked the questions. My mother cried, then grew quiet, then stopped speaking about him entirely. It was as if, overnight, he had simply been erased from our lives. And maybe that was easier. Maybe it was better than the not knowing. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I always knew it was a lie. Because you don't just disappear. Not without reason. Not without leaving something behind. I hadn't thought about him in years. Not until that morning, when I finally looked closer at the man on the corner. The moment I saw the jacket, I felt my stomach tighten. At first, I didn't understand why. It was just an old coat, nothing remarkable. Faded, tattered at the cuffs, the color worn from time. And then it clicked. I'd seen that jacket before, not just somewhere, on someone. My father, he'd had a gray wool coat exactly like it, the same cut, the same worn fabric, the same small tear near the left sleeve, the same missing top button. My head felt light. I blinked, gripping the strap of my bag as if it could tether me to the ground. It wasn't possible. It had been 10 years. And yet there it was, the jacket, my father's jacket, worn by a man I had never met. That day, instead of walking past him, I stopped. Up close, the details were even clearer. The jacket wasn't just similar, it was the same one. I could see the faint stain near the collar, the exact way the fabric had creased over years of wear. My throat was dry, my pulse hammered in my ears. "Where did you get that coat?" I asked. The man's expression didn't change. For a long moment, he just watched me. Then, slowly, he reached up, fingers brushing over the patch on the sleeve. His voice, when it came, was quiet. It was given to me. A chill ran through me. By who? He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether to answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "By a man who lost everything." My blood ran cold. I felt the air shift around me, the city noise fading into the background. I stepped closer. Who was he? A pause. Then he spoke. Low, careful. "You already know." A memory surfaced, a conversation I hadn't thought about in years. I was 15, sitting across from my father at the kitchen table. It had been one of those rare moments where he spoke about himself, about his past. "Some people don't just disappear," he had said. His voice was quiet, like he was talking to himself more than to me. I had frowned. "What do you mean?" He had sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sometimes they're made to disappear." It hadn't made sense to me then, but standing there, looking into the stranger's eyes, I understood. I wasn't just talking to some homeless man. I was talking to a ghost of my father's past. Someone who knew what happened to him. Someone who knew why he left. I took a step back. "Tell me the truth. Who are you?" The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Something that shattered everything I thought I knew. "I'm the reason he ran." I felt my body go cold. The noise of the city faded. The distant honks, the low hum of passing voices, the shuffle of footsteps on the pavement, all of it drowned beneath the weight of his words. "I'm the reason he ran." My throat tightened. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The rational part of me, the part that functioned in meetings, that paid bills, that dismissed paranoia, wanted to scoff, to shake my head, step back and walk away. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. The way he said it wasn't dramatic. There was no smugness, no theatrics, just a quiet, matter-of-fact statement. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay even. "What?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether I deserved an answer. Then, finally, and knew something he wasn't supposed to. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I wanted to press him for more. What did he know? Why did he leave? Where is he now? But I could barely keep my mind straight. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something deep, something dark, something I wasn't meant to look into. The man must have seen the shift in my expression, because his gaze softened. "You shouldn't go looking for him," he said. "Some people disappear for a reason." I stared at him, my pulse thudding against my temples. And then, before I could say another word, he turned and walked away. It happened so fast, so casually, as if our entire conversation had never happened. He melted into the stream of pedestrians, his form swallowed by the morning crowd. I could have followed him. I almost did, but something in my gut, something primal, told me not to. I stood there for a long time, my breath uneven, my hands ice cold despite the warmth of the sun. Then, finally, I turned and went inside my office. I barely got through work that day. My mind wouldn't stop circling the same thoughts, the same possibilities. Was my father alive? Was he in hiding? And from who? I thought about calling my mother, but what would I even say? "Hey, remember Dad? Yeah, I think I just met a guy who knows what happened to him." She had worked so hard to move on, to push his disappearance into the past. Digging it back up after all these years felt wrong, but doing nothing felt worse. So, that night I did what any restless, paranoid person would do. I started searching. I didn't have much to go on, but I had my father's old records. Some paperwork my mother never threw away. A work history, old bank statements, a few contacts he had listed for emergencies. I started making calls. Most of them went nowhere, disconnected numbers, dead ends. But one answered. It was an old friend of his, a guy named Carl Whitmore. I barely remembered him, just a vague recollection of a man who used to come over for dinner a few times when I was a kid. The second I said my name, there was silence. Then, in a hushed voice, Carl asked, "Why are you calling me about your father?" My stomach clenched. "Because I need to know what happened to him." Another pause. Then, quieter, "Has someone been watching you?" The question sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Had someone been watching me? The man on the street? Was that what he had been doing all along? I swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't know." Carl exhaled sharply. "Listen to me. Let it go. Whatever you think you want to know, it's not worth it. Your father knew that. That's why he left." "Left to go where?" "I don't know," Carl said. "And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." "Carl, forget this number." Click. The call ended. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my phone. I should have been frustrated, angry, but mostly I felt uneasy. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone. Carl had sounded afraid, genuinely afraid. And that terrified me. Because if he was scared, if my father had been scared, then what the hell had he gotten involved in? And more importantly, was it coming for me now? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what to do next. I wanted to keep searching, but something inside me, something instinctual, was telling me to stop, to listen to Carl, to let it go. And maybe I would have. Maybe I would have shut the door on the past and moved on with my life. But the next morning, when I stepped outside for work, I felt it. That sinking feeling. Like I was being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the street. Pedestrians walked by, cars crawled through traffic, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, there, across the street, the man was back. Same tattered jacket, same hollow stare. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward me. I didn't go to work that day. I turned around, locked my apartment door, and sat with my back against it, heart pounding, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he wanted. But I knew one thing. He wasn't just some homeless man. And whatever my father had run from, it had finally found me. I stayed in my apartment for the rest of the day. I didn't turn on the lights. I barely moved. Every time I so much as breathed, I felt like someone was listening. I sat by the peephole for hours, watching the hallway, waiting for a shadow to move across the door. I didn't know what I was expecting. Someone knocking? A voice calling my name? The sound of a key slipping into the lock. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion got the best of me. I crashed on the couch, my mind replaying every single moment of the last few days. The man on the street, the jacket, the phone call, and that one sentence that refused to leave my head. "I'm the reason he ran." I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was dark. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, too thick, too heavy. And then, a noise, soft, subtle, coming from outside my door. I held my breath. It wasn't knocking, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, measured. Someone standing just outside, listening, waiting. I stayed completely still, my fingers gripping the couch. My pulse thudded against my skull. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. I stared at it, my whole body locking up. My apartment had no windows facing the hallway. I had no way of seeing who was out there. Seconds passed, then minutes. I didn't move until I heard the faintest sound of footsteps retreating. Slow, steady, like whoever had been there wanted me to know they weren't in a rush. Finally, when the silence stretched long enough that my ears rang from the pressure, I crawled forward. The note was folded, crisp, almost too clean for something delivered like this. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside there was only one line, written in my father's handwriting. "Stop looking." I don't remember the next few minutes. Maybe I sat there, maybe I whispered something under my breath, maybe I closed my eyes and pretended I was dreaming. But deep down, I knew this was real. I knew my father was alive. And more than that, I knew he was watching. I should have been relieved. I should have felt some kind of closure, some kind of answer after all these years. But I didn't. Because if he was alive, that meant he had never left. He had just been hiding from them, from the man on the street. And now, because I had been stupid enough to start digging, they knew where I was, too. That night, I packed a bag. I called my boss, told him I was taking a leave of absence. I didn't say why. Then, I turned off my phone, threw it in the trash, and left my apartment. Not just for the night, not just for a while, for good. Because whatever my father had been running from, whatever shadow had been looming over his life for the past 10 years, it had finally caught up to me, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. I sat there on the floor for what felt like an eternity, the note still clenched in my fingers, the weight of it pressed into my chest, heavy, suffocating. Stop looking. Not a warning, a command. I knew then, without a doubt, that my father was alive. But he wasn't trying to find me. He wasn't coming back. He was keeping me away, and that meant only one thing. Whatever he ran from, he was still running. And now, because I had gone looking, I had put myself in the same danger. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, my body humming with adrenaline. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable. I grabbed my phone, staring at the screen, debating whether to call someone. The police? My mother? But what would I even say? The man gave me a note in my missing father's handwriting. Please help. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, even if an officer came by, interviewed me, what could they do? This wasn't just about a missing person. This was about someone who didn't want to be found. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my head. I needed to be rational, logical. I needed to do what my father had done. I needed to disappear. I packed a small bag, just the essentials. Cash, a change of clothes, my passport. Then, I did something I never thought I would. I pulled the SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half, and dropped it in the sink. Then, I turned on the faucet and let the water carry the tiny pieces down the drain. No more tracking, no more calls. I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't leave right away, that would be too obvious. Instead, I waited until just before dawn, when the streets were empty, when the city was quiet. I kept my hood up, my head down. I walked in the opposite direction of my office, of my usual coffee shop, of anywhere someone might expect me to go. I went to the train station, bought a ticket to a city I had never been to, and when the train doors slid shut behind me, I exhaled for the first time in hours. But as I stared out the window, watching the skyline shrink into the distance, one thought refused to leave my mind. Was it over? Or had I just put myself one step closer to whatever my father had been running from? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to find out. And if I was smart, I never would. That was 2 years ago. I don't live in the same city anymore. I don't use my real name. I don't stay in one place for too long. I still don't know what my father was caught up in, and I don't ask. I don't search for him. And if he's out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, making sure I listened, I hope he knows that I did. Because I don't want to know the truth anymore. I just want to be left alone. And I hope, God, I hope, they let me. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get paranoid. I've spent my whole life working with locks, securing homes, fixing broken doors. I know what keeps people safe. But after what happened a few years ago, I don't feel safe anymore. And if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't either. I used to be a locksmith. A good one, too. I worked for a small company that handled everything from apartment lockouts to high-security installations. Most of the time, it was straightforward. People lose their keys. People need their locks changed after a breakup. Nothing strange. Until I got a call one night that changed everything. It was around 9 p.m. when dispatch called me. I was just about to settle in for the night when my work phone buzzed. "Got a job for you," "Last-minute call-in," my boss said. "Lady's locked out of her house. She sounds shaken up. Might be an emergency." I sighed, already exhausted from the day, but overtime meant extra pay. "Address?" I asked. He gave it to me. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes away. I grabbed my gear and headed out. The street was dark when I arrived. No streetlights, just the glow from a few scattered porch lights. The house in question was a 2-story, older model, the kind with a wraparound porch and a heavy oak door. It was well maintained, nothing out of the ordinary, except for the woman standing outside. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in a loose cardigan and jeans. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her eyes darted around as if she expected something or someone to jump out of the shadows. She looked scared. I parked and grabbed my tools. As I walked up, I gave her the usual greeting. "Luck out, ma'am." She nodded quickly. Yes, please, She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the darkened windows. I followed her gaze. Nothing looked off. The house was still, quiet, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I forced a smile. No worries. Should only take a few minutes. She nodded again, stepping aside. I knelt in front of the lock and got to work. It was an older model, but nothing I couldn't handle. As I picked, I tried to make conversation to ease her nerves. "Lose your keys?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a tight voice, she said, "No, I didn't lose them. Someone else has them." I stopped mid-pick, looking up. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She was shaking. My gut twisted. "Someone broke in?" I asked carefully. She exhaled sharply, nodding. I think so. I don't know. The locks were fine when I left this morning, but when I got home, the front door was unlocked, and I never leave it unlocked." I frowned. "Did you call the police?" She hesitated again. "No. I thought about it, but..." She stopped, shaking her head. I didn't press. Some people don't trust the cops. Others don't want to cause a scene. But something about her demeanor felt off. I went back to work. Within a minute, the lock clicked. I stood up, stepping aside. "All said," I said. "Do you want me to check inside first, make sure no one's there?" She hesitated. Then she whispered, "Would you..." That was my second red flag. Locksmiths don't usually go inside. Liability and all that, but I'm not heartless. The woman looked genuinely terrified. I nodded. She reached for the handle, but stopped. Then, after a second, she gestured for me to open it instead. That was my third red flag. Something about this wasn't right. I pushed the door open. The house was dark, the air inside stale, heavy. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, but underneath it was something else, something off. I stepped inside, flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. "The power's out?" I asked, turning back to her. She nodded. "It was fine this morning. When I got home, nothing worked." Another layer of unease settled in my gut. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a neat, perfectly normal-looking home. A couch, a coffee table, family photos on the wall. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there. That quiet, creeping sensation that something isn't where it should be. I stepped further inside, scanning the living room. Everything looked untouched. Then I saw the hallway. The door at the end was open. Just slightly, like someone had been watching the front door and left in a hurry. A chill ran through me. I turned to the woman, keeping my voice steady. "You said the door was unlocked when you got home?" She nodded. I swallowed. "Did you check inside before you called me?" She shook her head. My pulse spiked. That meant whoever had been here could still be inside. Slowly, I reached into my bag, pulling out the heavy-duty flashlight I kept for jobs like this. I stepped toward the hallway, moving as quietly as possible. The air grew thicker, the smell, stale, human, got stronger. I reached the open door, pushed it, and froze. The closet was full of blankets, old boxes, and hanging coats. But between them, half hidden in the dark, I saw a pair of shoes, and they weren't empty. My chest locked up. Someone was in there. I didn't move. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was seeing things, that the shoes were just part of the mess. Then they shifted. I backed up fast, heart slamming against my ribs. "There's someone in your house." My voice was low, urgent. "We need to go. Now." The woman's eyes widened. She turned, bolting for the door. I didn't look back. We ran onto the porch just as something inside moved. A rustling sound, then the soft, unmistakable creak of floorboards. We sprinted to my van. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. The woman was already sobbing. I dialed 911. When the cops arrived, they searched the house. Nothing. No one inside. No signs of forced entry. No proof that anyone had been there at all. But here's the part that still haunts me. They found a crawl space in the attic. Inside it, a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, a small pile of clothing. Someone had been living there. Watching, listening, waiting. That was the last job I ever took. Because now, every time I hear a creak in my own house, I wonder if someone is still inside. I don't really know how to start this. I've told a few close friends, but every time I do, I feel like I sound crazy. But I swear this happened. For a while, I worked as a park ranger at a remote national park. I won't say which one because, well, if you've ever heard of the missing 411 cases, you'll understand why. Most of the job was boring, checking trails, making sure campers weren't doing anything stupid, responding to the occasional lost hiker. Pretty standard stuff. But the nights were different. The park had designated campgrounds, but there were always those hardcore hikers who wanted to venture deep into the backcountry. Those were the ones we worried about. Because sometimes they didn't come back. And sometimes they called for help. This happened in late September, right before the park started shutting down for the season. I was covering the overnight shift, monitoring the radio while my partner Dave was out on patrol. It was a quiet night, until the walkie crackled. Not the main radio, but my walkie-talkie. Now, that might not seem weird, but the only people who had access to our channel were park staff. And this voice? It wasn't anyone I knew. I grabbed the walkie, holding it to my ear. The transmission was full of static, but beneath it I could hear it. A man's voice. Low, panicked. "Help me." I sat up fast, my stomach twisting. "Hello? This is Park Ranger Lewis. Can you repeat that?" The signal was weak, garbled, like the voice was coming from far away. Then, clearer this time. "Help me, please. I'm lost. I don't know where I am." I grabbed the radio, flipping to the main frequency. "HQ, this is Lewis. I just got an SOS on my walkie. Do we have any hikers reported missing?" There was a pause, then static. Finally, the supervisor's voice came through. "Negative. No missing persons reports." I hesitated. If no one had been reported missing, who the hell was on our private channel? I switched back to the walkie. "Sir, can you tell me your name, your location?" Nothing. Just static. Then, deep breathing. Slow, labored. Like whoever was on the other end was hurt. "It's dark. I don't know where I am." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight, already heading for the ATV parked outside the ranger station. "Okay, stay calm. Do you have any landmarks nearby? Anything you can see?" For a long moment, silence. Then, why do I say you? I stopped cold. The walkie hissed with static, the signal warping, stretching, distorting. My heart hammered. I turned in a slow circle, flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. Just the empty ranger station, the dark woods, the distant mountains. I swallowed hard, gripping the walkie tight. "What do you mean, you see me?" The static spiked. Then, laughter. Low. Breathless. Not a man's voice anymore. I dropped the walkie. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, the speaker still crackling, hissing like a thing alive. I backed up toward the ATV, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Then, just before I reached it, the walkie went silent. Not static, not breathing, just dead air, like whatever had been speaking had left. Or worse, it was never there to begin with. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I barely breathed. I sat in the ranger station with the doors locked, the radio clutched in my hand, waiting for the voice to come back. It never did. The next morning I told my supervisor. He just gave me a look. The kind that said, "Drop it." I did. For the rest of my time as a ranger, I never worked the night shift alone again. But the worst part? A week later, a hiker was reported missing. When they found his body, it was deep in the woods, miles from any trail. His radio was still clutched in his frozen hands. The Rangers never released the recording, but I know what they heard, because that night, when I was all alone in the dark, I heard it too. A week after the night I heard the voice on my walkie, the missing hiker's body was found. It was a search and rescue team that discovered him, about 12 miles from the nearest trail, way off any marked paths. He was face down in a dry creek bed, body twisted like he had fallen from somewhere high. His radio was still gripped in his stiff fingers, pressed tight against his mouth like he'd died calling for help. But here's the thing. His radio? It was on our private ranger frequency. The same one that no civilian should have access to. The same one I had heard that voice on the week before. The coroner ruled it exposure and a fall injury. Said he must have gotten lost, wandered too far, slipped and broken his leg before succumbing to the cold. A tragic accident. Case closed. Except it didn't make sense. The way his body was found. There were no tracks leading to or from him. Not his, not animals, not anyone's. Like he had just appeared there. I asked to hear the final transmission on his radio, but the higher-ups wouldn't release it. Classified evidence, they said, even to park staff. But one of the search team guys, someone I trusted, pulled me aside a few days later. His face was pale, hands shaking when he lit his cigarette. He looked me dead in the eye and said that radio was broadcasting. I swallowed. Broadcasting what? He hesitated, looking over his shoulder, then leaned in. Dead air. I frowned. What do you mean? He exhaled shakily. I mean, it was transmitting the whole time. When we found him, when we checked his radio. But there was nothing on the other end, no voice, no static, just this hollow, empty sound, like something was still listening. A chill ran down my spine. And Lewis, he continued, his voice dropped even lower. The battery was dead. I quit the job a month later. I don't go hiking anymore. And I don't ever keep a walkie-talkie in my house. Because sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The low hum crackling static. And just beneath it, breathing. I don't even know how to start this, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. I don't know anymore. This happened 2 years ago, and to this day I haven't been able to go camping again. The thought of it makes my stomach twist. So, for context, I've always loved the outdoors. Grew up hiking, camping, doing all that solo survivalist crap that made me feel like some kind of badass. I knew how to handle myself in the woods, how to navigate, how to listen to the sounds of nature and know when something wasn't right. That last part? I wish I had listened to it sooner. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, me and 3 buddies, just a chill guys getaway deep in the mountains. We picked a spot about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, somewhere totally off-grid. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. The first night was perfect. We drank, we laughed, we told dumb horror stories around the fire, the usual. Around 2 a.m. we all finally crashed in our tents. Nothing weird. The second night, though, that's when everything changed. It started subtle. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire alone, just staring into the flames while the others were already in their tents. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The kind of silence that presses in, where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not wind through the trees. An actual voice. Faint, distant, but there. I froze, my skin prickling. It came from beyond the firelight, out in the trees. Too far to make out words, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. At first, I thought maybe one of my friends had gotten up to take a piss and was messing with me. But then I heard another one. A second whisper, layered under the first, coming from the opposite direction. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Wind. Just the wind. Then it moved. The whispering shifted, circling us. One moment it was near the trees behind me, the next it was coming from the right, then the left. Always just outside the fire's glow. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but the words were just out of reach, like a conversation you're not meant to be a part of. Then I laughed. Low, breathless, way too close. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. Just the same unmoving forest, the same tall pines, their black silhouettes swaying against the star-dotted sky. I told myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation, paranoia, the way fire messes with your senses in the dark. So, like an idiot, I convinced myself to ignore it. I put out the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to close my eyes. That was mistake number one. I don't know how long I laid there, but at some point I drifted off. And then, in the dead of night, something woke me up. A whisper, outside my tent. I stopped breathing. It was so quiet, so deliberate, like someone was crouched inches from the fabric, speaking directly to me. I couldn't make out the words, but it was low, raspy, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't used to speaking. I wanted to scream, I wanted to move, but I just lay there, my muscles locked up, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Then, slowly the whispering moved, circling the tent. It was multiple voices now, soft, murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot, just beyond understanding. And then the zipper moved. Not a lot, just a little, a soft, slow tug. I snapped out of my paralysis and lunged for my knife. Silence. The whispering stopped. My breath was the only sound in the tent, coming in short, panicked bursts. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my friends were already awake, looking just as freaked out as I felt. Before I could even say anything, Mike, the most level-headed guy in our group, spoke first. You guys heard it too, right? Turns out I wasn't alone. Each of them had woken up at some point in the night to the whispers. They'd heard the voices circling the camp, moving through the trees. But the worst part? None of us had unzipped our tents. But in the dirt around the campsite there were footprints. Not ours. They were thin, bare, too many, circling each tent. We packed up and got the hell out of there within 10 minutes, leaving most of our gear behind. None of us spoke the entire hike back. I don't know what was out there, I don't know what we heard, what we almost saw, but I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in those woods, and whatever was out there, it never wanted us to leave. I haven't been camping since. I had never spent a night alone before. Not completely alone. Sure, my parents had left me home while they ran errands or went out to dinner. But this was different. This was 3 whole nights by myself. I was 13 at the time, old enough to stay home without a babysitter, but still young enough that the idea of being alone for that long made me uneasy. I didn't tell my parents that, though. I wanted to prove I could handle it. They were going out of town for a wedding. One of my dad's old college friends was getting married in another state. They'd booked a hotel, packed their bags, and told me I was responsible enough to stay home this time. "You'll be fine," Mom had said, kissing the top of my head before leaving. "You're mature for your age. Just call us if you need anything." I had nodded, forcing a smile. I didn't want them to think I was nervous, but I was. Not because I was scared of the dark or sleeping alone, but because something about the house felt different without them. Too quiet, too empty. The first night was fine. I ordered pizza, played video games, and kept all the lights on like some little kid afraid of monsters. By midnight, I'd convinced myself I was being stupid. It was just a house, my house, the same one I'd lived in my whole life. Nothing had changed. At least that's what I thought. But when I woke up the next morning, the back door was unlocked. At first, I told myself I had just forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I had gone out back the night before and didn't remember. Maybe I hadn't pulled the handle hard enough, and the wind had pushed it open a little. That had to be it. Still, I felt uneasy as I locked it again, double-checking it this time. Something about waking up to an unlocked door just felt wrong. That day dragged by slowly. I spent most of it watching TV, trying to keep myself distracted. But every so often, my mind would wander back to the door. Had it really been me? Or had someone else, something else, been in the house? By the time the sun set, I was exhausted from overthinking. I decided to call it an early night, but as I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a memory crept back into my mind. Something I hadn't thought about until now. I had seen a man outside a few nights before my parents left. I had been taking the trash out when I saw him. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet. Our street wasn't busy at night, just a row of houses with long driveways and darkened windows. As I dragged the trash bin to the curb, I spotted him standing at the corner. A man. Too far away to see clearly, but something about him made me pause. He wasn't walking like a normal person heading somewhere. He was just standing there, still, watching. I remembered feeling uneasy, but I'd shaken it off. Just some guy out for a walk. But then the next night, he was there again. Same spot, same stillness. I had only glanced at him that time, hurrying back inside. Told myself I was imagining things, and then just like that, I had forgotten about him. Until now. Until I woke up in an empty house and found the back door unlocked. I stood in the bathroom, toothbrush still in my mouth, staring at my own reflection. The more I thought about it, the more I knew that man hadn't just been some random person. He had been watching. And now, with my parents gone and me here alone, something didn't feel right. I tried to shake it off, rinsing my mouth and turning off the light. Just my imagination. That's all. I was psyching myself out. But as I walked down the hall toward my bedroom, my foot squelched against the tile. I froze. Slowly, I looked down. A wet footprint. Right in the middle of the hallway. I swallowed hard. Maybe I had spilled something earlier. Maybe I had walked inside with wet shoes and didn't realize it. But then I saw another. And another. A trail of damp, muddy footprints leading from the back door, which I had locked this morning, through the kitchen and into the living room. My stomach twisted. I followed them carefully, my breathing shallow. The prints were spaced apart heel to toe, like someone had walked through my house, barefoot, leaving a silent trail behind. I reached the living room and stopped. The footprints ended at the couch, like someone had stood there, watching, and then what? Where did they go? My skin prickled. I turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit room. The windows were locked. The front door was shut. No other footprints leading away. Whoever left them, never left. I was still not alone. My throat felt tight. I turned in slow circles, scanning every dark corner of the living room. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. The back door was locked. The windows were shut. There were no footprints leading away. So where did they go? A sharp creak echoed through the house. I spun around. The sound had come from down the hall, near my bedroom. My entire body tensed. I forced myself to breathe slowly, my ears straining for any other noise. Silence. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was in here with me. I moved carefully, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. Call someone. That thought pounded in my head, but my body refused to listen. Instead, I followed the footprints back toward the hallway, stepping as lightly as I could. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. It had been closed before. A single sliver of darkness stretched across the floor, leading into my room. My stomach twisted. I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The room was empty, or at least it looked that way. I took a shaky breath, scanning every inch of the space. My bed was unmade, the blanket slightly pulled back from where I had slept the night before. My closet was shut. The desk chair was exactly where I left it. But then, the closet door moved, just an inch. Not enough to be the wind, not enough to be an accident. Someone was in there, hiding, watching me. I felt something cold creep up my spine. I could run. I could turn and bolt out of the house, sprint to a neighbor's door, or call the police. Or I could find out who had been watching me for days. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. Then, a voice, barely above a whisper. "Don't." My breath caught in my throat. That whisper, so quiet, so close, sent ice through my veins. I took a shaky step back. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, to call someone, but my body wouldn't move. The closet door stood still. The silence was unbearable. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Number, I knew what I heard, and whoever was in there knew. I heard it too. I forced myself to move, stepping back toward the hallway, never taking my eyes off the closet. My fingers fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my breathing too loud in the dead silence of the house. 911. I barely heard the first ring over the pounding in my chest. Then, a voice. 911. What's your emergency? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, the closet door burst open. I didn't see a face, just movement. A blur of dark clothing. A man. He shoved past me so fast that I stumbled back, almost dropping my phone. I heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway, then the sharp slam of the back door flying open. He was running. I gasped for air, spinning toward the sound. By the time I reached the back door, he was already gone. I stood there, shaking, staring into the darkness outside. The night was still, silent, as if nothing had just happened, but someone had been inside my house watching me, and I had no idea for how long. The police arrived within minutes. I barely remember what I told them. I was still in shock, my hands shaking too hard to hold my phone properly. I explained about the wet footprints, about the closet door, about the whisper, about how I had seen a man standing on the street for nights before my parents left. An officer checked the backyard, shining a flashlight over the grass, but the man was gone. There were muddy footprints outside leading from the back door, but they ended a few houses down, vanishing into the street. Like he had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The police searched the house, checked the locks, reassured me that everything seemed safe now. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the police left, even after I triple-checked every lock in the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the fact that a stranger had been inside my closet. It wasn't just the fact that he had been watching me for days. It was the fact that I never heard him come in. I kept running over it in my head. The back door had been locked when I went to sleep. The windows were shut. There was no sign of a break-in. So how had he gotten inside? The next morning I did something I'd never done before. I searched my own house. I checked everything, every lock, every window, every possible way someone could have gotten in. And then, in the hallway near the laundry room, I saw it. A tiny square in the ceiling. The attic entrance. My stomach dropped. The attic. I'd never paid much attention to it before. We never really used it. Just a small space above the house for insulation and old Christmas decorations. But now, staring up at it, a terrible thought formed in my mind. I grabbed the stepladder from the closet. My hands were sweating as I set it up, the cheap metal wobbling slightly under my weight as I climbed up. I reached for the latch, hesitated, and then pushed it open. The wooden panel slid back with a soft scrape. A wave of dust drifted down, making me cough. I lifted my phone, turning on the flashlight, and that's when I saw it. A sleeping bag, a half-empty water bottle, and next to it, oh, a crumpled candy wrapper, my candy. From my kitchen, I nearly fell off the ladder. Someone had been living in my attic. I scrambled down, heart pounding, backing away like the opening in the ceiling might swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. The man hadn't just broken in last night. He had been here for days, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I still didn't know who he was, or if he was coming back. My hands were shaking as I called the police again. This time, they took it seriously. When the officers arrived, I barely got the words out. The attic. There's something up there. He was living here. They exchanged a look before grabbing a flashlight and pulling themselves up into the crawl space. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for them to confirm what I already knew. And then, Jesus Christ. One of the officers swore under his breath. I heard the soft rustling of plastic, the scrape of something shifting in the dust. Then, an officer's voice. Kid. He wasn't just living up here. He climbed back down, holding something in his gloved hand, a notebook. My stomach twisted. The officer flipped through it, his expression darkening. I couldn't see the pages, but I could see his face, his frown, the way his grip on the book tightened. Finally, he looked at me. He was keeping notes on you. The police searched the attic thoroughly after that. They found more things. Empty food wrappers, bottles of water taken from my own fridge, a pile of blankets that smelled like sweat and dust. And the worst part, the handwriting in the notebook. Pages filled with times, dates, notes about my routine. When I went to sleep, when I left for school, when I was alone. One sentence stood out, written near the bottom of a page from last week. Parents leaving Friday, house empty, perfect time. They never caught him. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. The police said he probably slipped out during the first search, vanishing into the neighborhood before they could track him. They promised to patrol the area, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter, because he was already gone. And whoever he was, he had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. I never spent another night alone in that house. When my parents got home, I told them everything. My mom cried. My dad looked like he wanted to break something. We moved 3 months later, new city, new house, no attic. But even now, years later, I still find myself double-checking locks. Still feeling like someone is watching when I walk home alone. Because the scariest part? He could be anywhere. I always hated working the night shift. Something about the dead hours between midnight and dawn made the world feel off. The diner sat at the edge of town, perched along a lonely stretch of highway where headlights rarely passed. It was the kind of place truckers stopped when they had nowhere else to go, and drifters used as a temporary escape from the cold. The neon sign hummed outside, flickering like a heartbeat, casting a dull red glow over the empty parking lot. It was a slow night. The kind where time stretched and distorted, where minutes felt like hours and every little sound, the buzzing light, the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional groan of the wind outside, felt amplified. I leaned against the counter, absently wiping down a spotless coffee mug just to keep my hands busy. My coworker, Benny, had gone out back for a smoke break, leaving me alone with the radio's quiet drone. The clock read 2:47 a.m. That's when I noticed him. He sat in the farthest booth, by the window. I didn't hear the bell above the door chime, didn't see him walk in, but there he was, motionless, watching. The diner's dim light cast long shadows over his face, obscuring most of his features, but I could tell he was old. His skin was pale, almost gray, and deep wrinkles folded over his knuckles where his hands rested flat on the table. He didn't have a menu, didn't have a coffee in front of him, just sat there, silent, staring at nothing. A chill crawled down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Get a grip, it's just another late-night regular. I cleared my throat, grabbing my notepad as I walked toward him. Evening, can I get you something? No response. His eyes didn't even flicker toward me. He sat stiff, barely breathing, like a mannequin dressed in an old black suit. A faint smell clung to him, stale, like mothballs and dust. The scent of something long forgotten. I tried again. Sir, you doing okay? Still nothing. Unease coiled in my gut, but I forced a polite smile. Maybe he was hard of hearing, maybe just lost in thought. I was about to walk away when his fingers twitched ever so slightly. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "Do you know what time it is?" Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. The words were deliberate, slow, each syllable dragged like a dull knife across skin. I swallowed. Just past 2:50. He didn't react. For a long, horrible moment, we just stood there. Me gripping my notepad so tightly my knuckles ached, and him sitting still as death. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird old guy passing through, maybe a little senile. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. The booth was empty. I spun back around, heart hammering in my chest, but he was still there, seated exactly as before, as if he hadn't moved. And yet, in the reflection, the booth held nothing but shadows. The air in the diner felt suddenly wrong, heavy, thick. A pressure built behind my ribs, like the room itself was closing in. The bell above the door rang, breaking the silence. Benny strolled back in, rubbing his arms against the cold. "Damn, it's freezing out there." He shook the rain from his jacket, glancing at me. "You good? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, shaky and brittle. "Yeah, just weird customer." I jerked my thumb toward the booth. But when I turned back, the man was gone. The seat was empty, no coffee cup, no lingering warmth where a body had been. Just a dry, mothball-scented presence that made my skin prickle. Benny frowned. "What customer?" I felt my stomach drop. The guy who was just sitting there. "There hasn't been anyone in here all night, dude." I opened my mouth to argue, to insist I had seen him, spoken to him, but the words withered in my throat. I felt cold. And then I noticed something else. The clock above the counter still read 2:47 a.m. It hadn't moved. A thick silence settled between us. Benny frowned up at the clock, then at me, then back again. "That's weird, right?" I couldn't answer. My thoughts were scrambling, clawing for something logical, something normal to ground me. The air smelled different, like old books and damp fabric. Then, somewhere behind me, in a voice as soft as the grave, I heard it again. "You know what time it is?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The last customer had never left. I gripped the counter so hard my nails dug into the worn formica. Benny's face shifted, a frown settling between his brows as he glanced around, uneasy. He must have heard it too. The diner, once just another mundane, greasy little stop on the highway, now felt wrong. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. "This isn't happening." The radio crackled. A low hum, distorted static, like something trying to push through the signal. The fluorescent light above the counter flickered, buzzing in an erratic rhythm. Benny muttered a curse, glancing toward the clock. His fingers twitched, tapping against his arm as if waiting for time to move. It didn't. 2:47 a.m. Still, unchanging. The temperature in the diner had dropped, not in the way it does when someone opens the door, but deeper, like the very warmth was being drained from the room. Benny shifted. His voice, usually brimming with sarcasm, was small. "Dude, are we—" A sound cut him off. Not a voice. Not static. A slow, deliberate creak, like the weight of something pressing against the floorboards. Right behind me. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My breath came shallow, my skin crawling with the electric charge of something unseen. Benny's face drained of color, his eyes locked on something over my shoulder. I swallowed. "Benny!" His mouth opened, then closed, his Adam's apple bobbed. And then, in a motion too fast to be natural, his eyes snapped to the booth. Empty. I forced myself to turn. The diner looked the same as before. Beaten vinyl booths, dull counter stools, the faint reflection of neon against the windows. But something was missing. Or maybe something had never been there to begin with. My voice came out hoarse. "We need to get out of here." Benny barely nodded before a sharp, grating screech cut through the diner. The clock. The hands had begun moving again, but backward. The second hand jerked, resisting some unseen force, fighting against the flow of time itself. It ticked, then stalled, ticked again, then slid in reverse. 2:46 a.m. The world seemed to breathe around us, stretching and distorting. My head spun, my stomach twisted in knots. The very air of the diner felt pulled thin, stretched beyond what it should be. The static on the radio rose to a high-pitched whine, and then... click. Silence. The radio died. The fluorescent lights buzzed once, then blinked out, plunging the diner into darkness except for the weak, sputtering glow of the neon sign outside. Benny cursed under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" A shadow shifted near the booth. Not a trick of the light. Something moved. I grabbed Benny's wrist, gripping so tight my fingers burned. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The neon's faint red glow outlined a shape, something that shouldn't be there. It was him, seated exactly as before, hands resting on the table, motionless. But this time his head was turned toward us. Watching, his lips curled into something that was almost a smile. I stopped breathing. The radio crackled. And then, in that same slow, deliberate whisper, he spoke. "Do you know what time it is?" The words coiled around me, slipping under my skin, into my bones. Benny was rigid beside me, his pulse a frantic rhythm against my grip. I swallowed, forcing my voice to work, forcing myself to say something, anything. It's almost 3. The smile stretched wider. Too wide. His teeth were too straight, too uniform, like they had been placed there instead of grown. The air around him blurred, warped, like heat rising from asphalt. 2:45 a.m. The hands on the clock continued to turn in reverse. Time was unraveling. My breath came short and fast, my throat dry as sandpaper. I had to move. We had to go. But Benny wasn't moving. His eyes were locked on the figure, his lips parted in silent terror. Then, in a jerky, mechanical motion, his head twitched. Once, twice, before he whispered, "I think I remember him." The diner lurched. Not the ground, not the walls, but something beneath the surface of the world itself, like reality had hiccuped, like the very fabric of existence had tilted. And then Benny let go of my hand and started walking toward the booth. Benny took a step forward. His movements were slow, dreamlike, as if he wasn't fully in control of his body. His eyes were wide but unfocused, his breath shallow. "Benny, stop." My voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of it felt wrong in the stillness of the diner. He didn't stop. Another step. The figure in the booth remained unmoving, his face still locked in that too wide grin. The shadows around him twisted, pulsing in a way that made my stomach churn. He wasn't just sitting there anymore. He was waiting. I reached out, grabbing Benny's arm with every ounce of strength I had left. "Benny, we have to go." His body stiffened under my grip. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep trance, his expression shifting from blank detachment to sudden, overwhelming fear. The second he turned back toward me, the diner shifted again. A deep, gut-wrenching pull, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The clock above the counter jerked violently. The second hand snapped backward, ticking in rapid, erratic movements. 2:44 a.m. The man in the booth inhaled. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of something old, something tired, waking up. Then he moved. Not like a person. His body didn't shift. He didn't rise, didn't stand. He just wasn't in the booth anymore. He was closer, too close. Right beside me. A smell filled my nostrils. Dust, decay, the faint scent of something rotting in a forgotten place. Benny gasped, yanking his arm from my grip, stumbling backward. The neon light outside flickered, and for a split second, I saw him. The customer. His skin was stretched too thin, his grin splitting his face apart, revealing teeth upon teeth upon teeth. His eyes, dark pits, bore into me, the kind of gaze that knew me, that had always known me. "Do you know what time it is?" The words slithered past me, curling in my ears, pressing into my skull. 2:43 a.m. The walls of the diner groaned, the air warped, the second hand on the clock snapped off, spinning violently before falling into the void of its face. We weren't supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to see him. Something deep inside me screamed, "Run." I grabbed Benny's wrist, yanking him so hard we nearly crashed into the counter. His feet fumbled beneath him, but I didn't stop. I shoved through the diner door, the bell's cheerful chime ringing in my ears as we stumbled into the night. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no signs of life, just the vast, dark stretch of highway that disappeared into nothing. Benny was gasping beside me, bent over, hands on his knees. I turned back to the diner and froze. The inside was dark. Not empty, not abandoned, just gone. No flickering neon, no buzzing lights, just a hollow, black void where the diner should have been. I took a shaky step forward, my breath fogging in the cold air. And then, the sign above flickered. The diner snapped back into existence. Just like that. The lights were on again, the counter was clean, the booths were empty, the radio was playing some old tune from decades past. And the clock on the wall read 3:0 a.m. Time had moved forward. Benny straightened beside me, still panting. He was pale, his face glistening with sweat. What the hell was that? I shook my head, swallowing hard. I had no answer. The diner looked normal. It was as if nothing had happened. But as I turned back toward the road, one last thing caught my eye. The booth, the one at the very back. A single coffee cup sat there now, steaming as if it had just been poured. And beside it, a watch. Old. Silver. The glass cracked. And its hands? Still, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I didn't touch it. I didn't go back inside. I just walked away, Benny right beside me, neither of us daring to speak. Because we both knew the truth. The last customer had never left. And he never would. There were 5 of us. 5 friends who had once been inseparable, but over the years had drifted apart, each of us pulled in different directions by work, relationships, or just life in general. The plan seemed simple enough. A weekend camping trip in an isolated forest, far from everything, no phones, no distractions, just the fire, the stars, and the hope of reconnecting. It was Ethan who brought it up first. Ethan, the one who used to be the glue that held us all together. He'd been the one to organize our little gatherings in the past, even when it seemed like no one else could be bothered. This time, though, it was different. His message in the group chat was casual, almost nostalgic. How about we do something crazy? Go camping. We all need a break. At first it seemed like a bad idea, but then we all agreed. The thought of getting away from the noise of daily life was appealing, even if the idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere made me uneasy. There was Jamie, always the practical one, the one who kept track of everyone's schedules and made sure things got done. She had been Ethan's best friend since childhood, and even though they'd grown apart over the years, I could tell that he still held a special place in her life. When she agreed to the trip, I figured it was because she needed a break just as much as the rest of us. Her job had been stressing her out, and her recent breakup hadn't helped. She seemed eager to get away from everything. Then there was Tom. He was the jokester, the one who could lighten any mood. Tom always had something sarcastic to say, always made everyone laugh. I used to love how he could always crack a joke even in the most awkward situations. But lately, I noticed that even his jokes seemed hollow, like he was trying too hard to keep the group's energy up. He had just started a new job, and I could tell he was struggling. He didn't say much about it, but the trip seemed like his way of trying to reset. Sarah was the quiet one. She never said much, but she always noticed everything. She was the observer of the group, the one who seemed to see things we didn't. I'd always admired her sensitivity, but I could never tell if it was a gift or a curse. She hadn't been in touch much over the past few months, but I was glad to hear that she was coming along. I guess we all had our reasons for wanting to leave the world behind, even if none of us spoke them aloud. And then there was Ryan. Ryan was the one who never really fit in, the one who always seemed off. He wasn't the type to open up, even though we had known him for years. There was always something about him, something cold and detached. He'd been part of our group since high school, but even then, I could never put my finger on what it was about him that made me uneasy. He was quiet, so quiet that sometimes I forgot he was even there. And yet, every now and then, when he did speak, it felt like he was saying something just a little too strange, too calculated. When he said he was coming along, I was surprised, but I didn't think much of it. After all, it had been years since we all hung out together. Maybe this was his way of reconnecting. I should have paid more attention to that feeling, the one I'd always had, the nagging feeling that something was off about Ryan. But at the time, it didn't seem important. And so, we went. The forest was more isolated than I had imagined. Ethan drove us out there in his old rusted truck, winding down narrow gravel roads that seemed to vanish into the trees. The further we went, the more I began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. I could see it in Sarah's face, too. She stared out the window, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. Jamie, of course, was in charge of everything. She pulled out maps, made sure we had enough supplies, and started organizing the campsite with military precision. She always had a way of taking control, and I couldn't help but feel a little relieved that she was here. It was easy to let her do the heavy lifting while I watched. Tom, on the other hand, was goofing around, trying to get everyone to play a ridiculous game of charades while we set up the tents. His voice echoed through the trees, breaking the silence in a way that made me shiver slightly. It was as if the forest didn't like being disturbed. Ryan was just, there. He hadn't said much since we arrived. He barely even glanced at the campsite. He was standing a few yards away, leaning against a tree, looking off into the distance. He had a strange intensity about him, something that made me wonder if he was really present, or if his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. Ryan had always been like this, quiet, distant. Maybe that was just who he was. But I couldn't ignore the prickling on the back of my neck. Something was wrong. By the time night fell, the forest felt even more suffocating. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax." There's nothing out here but trees. But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different. Distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax. There's nothing out here but trees." But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different. Distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. Tom slammed on the gas and we sped off into the forest, the tires screeching as we tore down the narrow path. We didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting away. We made it. Somehow, we made it. We found service far enough down the road, and I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the campsite was empty. Ryan was gone. No trace of him. No evidence of what had happened. Nothing but the ashes of the fire we'd left behind. The police questioned us, but we didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain what we'd seen? How do you tell them about the man who was never really a man? The monster who had been walking among us for years. When they left, we drove back to the city in silence. I could feel the weight of the journal in my bag, but I didn't want to open it again. Not now, not ever. We were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was still out there, waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Because in the end, I realized something. He had always been in control. He had always been one step ahead of us. And now, I couldn't help but wonder, had we really escaped? Or had he just let us go? I used to work the late shift at Domino's, delivering pizzas until 2, sometimes 3 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most nights were uneventful. Drunk college kids, night shift workers, the occasional stoner who forgot they even ordered. It was all pretty routine. Then there was that night. It started like any other. The usual slow trickle of late-night orders, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 1:45 a.m., just as I was thinking about cleaning up and heading home, a last-minute order came in. 1 large pepperoni, paid in cash. The address wasn't far, somewhere on the outskirts of town, near a wooded area where houses were more spread out. I groaned, not thrilled about the idea of driving down an empty road that late, but a tip is a tip. I grabbed the box, hopped in my car, and punched the address into Google Maps. The route took me further away from civilization than I expected. Streetlights became sparse, and the houses were spaced farther apart, swallowed by darkness. I turned onto a narrow, cracked road lined with twisted, overgrown trees, their branches casting jagged shadows under my headlights. The GPS led me to a small, isolated house at the very end of the road. No lights were on. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The house looked abandoned. Paint peeling off the siding, a broken porch railing, weeds growing in tangled patches around the steps. I checked the ticket again. Yep, this was the address. I hesitated. Most people waiting for a pizza leave some kind of light on. A porch light, a living room lamp. Something. But this place was pitch black. I grabbed the pizza, stepped out of the car, and made my way up the creaking steps. I knocked twice, the sound too loud in the silence. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I sighed, already picturing some wasted guy passed out on the couch, forgetting he ordered. I reached for my phone to call the number on the receipt when I noticed something. The front door was slightly open. Not a lot, just a crack, barely enough to see into the house. But it had been closed when I got here, I was sure of it. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have left. I should have just turned around, gone back to my car, and driven away. But something about the whole situation made me uneasy. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. Darkness. Empty space. A hallway leading deeper into the house. The air smelled stale, like old wood and something slightly sour. No movement, no voices. Then, from somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked. I froze. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Another creak, closer this time. Then, in the dimness of the hallway, a shape moved. I didn't see details, just the faintest shift in the darkness, something tall, lurking just out of view. And then, a voice. "Come inside." Soft, hoarse, Ron. I dropped the pizza. My body finally obeyed, and I turned, bolting down the steps so fast I nearly tripped. My heart hammered as I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the car. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the porch. The door was wide open now. I could see further inside, see more of the hallway, more of the darkness. And standing just beyond the threshold was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He was too tall, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He stood there, completely still, just watching me. My hands shook as I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. As I backed away, the figure stepped forward. One slow, deliberate movement, like he was testing the air. I slammed the gas, peeling away down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the Domino's parking lot, still shaking as I stumbled inside. My manager took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. The empty house, the open door, the voice. He frowned, grabbing the store phone to call the number on the receipt. Disconnected. Then he checked the address. It didn't exist. The road, the house, nothing was there. The order had never been placed. There was no record of it in the system. I quit that night. I don't deliver anymore. But sometimes, when I'm out late, driving past dark, empty houses, I swear I see a door just slightly open, and a figure standing just beyond it, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every shadow in my room feeling too deep, too dark. My brain replayed the night over and over. The empty house, the door that had been closed, then cracked, then wide open, the voice that didn't sound quite right, and the figure, too tall, too still, watching me. But what bothered me the most wasn't the house, the order, or even the way the address didn't exist. It was the way he moved. Or rather, the way he barely moved at all. The step forward had been slow, measured, like he was waiting for something, like he knew I was watching. I tried telling myself it was a prank, some elaborate trick. But the address wasn't real, the number was disconnected, and I knew, deep in my gut, that I hadn't been meant to leave. The next day I drove back to where the house had been. Or where I thought it had been. The cracked road was still there, lined with its twisting trees and jagged shadows. But at the end of the road, where the house had stood, there was nothing. No foundation, no debris, just an overgrown clearing, the weeds waist-high, swaying slightly in the wind, like no house had ever been there. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow gone to the wrong place? But I knew that wasn't true. I had parked in this exact spot. I had seen the porch, the peeling paint, the broken railing. I had seen him. A sudden awful thought slithered into my mind. What if he's still here? I didn't stick around to find out. I left, drove straight home, locked the doors. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, I woke up to a knock at my door. It was 1:45 a.m., the exact time I had delivered that order. I sat up, heart pounding. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one came to my door this late. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, empty as ever. I stood there, listening, barely breathing. A full minute passed, then another. I exhaled shakily, backing away. I told myself it was nothing, just some drunk neighbor knocking on the wrong door. I turned to go back to bed. No, I froze. It was closer this time. Not at the door. At my bedroom window. I spun around, my stomach twisting violently. My apartment was 3 floors up. There was no balcony, no fire escape. There was no way anyone could be outside my window. But I heard it. And then the handle on my front door rattled. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and backed into the corner of the room, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The doorknob twisted slowly, testing. And then silence. No more knocking, no more rattling, just nothing. For hours I sat there, frozen in fear, waiting for it to come back. I didn't sleep, I didn't move. And when the sun finally rose, spilling weak morning light into my apartment, I finally worked up the courage to check the door. It was still locked, bolted, but something was waiting for me. A single piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I picked it up with numb fingers, unfolding it slowly. There were only 5 words, written in thin, careful letters. I found you this time. I threw up. I called the police, barely able to get the words out. They arrived within minutes, checking the building, searching for any sign of an intruder. They didn't find anything. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving my floor. There was no one in the hall, no one outside my window. They treated me like I was imagining things. I wasn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, lights on, every sound making my pulse spike. I checked the door every hour. I checked the windows. Nothing. For 3 nights, nothing happened. No knocks, no notes, no rattling doorknob. And then, the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. A text message from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. A photo, a picture of me asleep in my bed, taken from inside my apartment. I ran. I didn't grab anything. I just grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and bolted down the hallway. I drove straight to my friend's place across town and stayed there for a week. When I finally went back to my apartment, it felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was still lurking there, waiting for me to come back. But nothing happened. No more texts, no more knocks, nothing. Until last night. I had almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe somehow I had gotten away. Then, just as I was getting into bed, my phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. It was an address. I copied it into Google Maps, heart pounding. It was a police station. My stomach twisted. What the hell was this? Then another text came through. Check the news. I hesitated, then opened my laptop, my hands shaking as I typed. The first headline stopped my heart. Breaking. Man arrested after breaking into apartment. Stalked victim for months. I clicked the article, my vision blurring as I read. The man was caught breaking into someone else's apartment last night. A neighbor had called the cops after hearing strange noises. When they arrested him, he had a knife, a lock-picking kit, and dozens of photographs. Pictures of me, taken over the past year. My blood turned to ice. Another text came through. A single message. I wasn't working alone. I stared at the screen, my pulse a roaring drum in my ears. I typed back, my hands slick with sweat. Who is this? No response. And then, a knock at my door. I didn't move. The knock at my door wasn't loud. It was soft, deliberate. The kind of knock someone does when they know you're home, when they're waiting. I gripped my phone tightly, my fingers slick with sweat, my mind racing. Whoever had been texting me knew things. Whoever had broken into my apartment had been caught. But if he had a partner, someone still out there, who the hell was at my door now? I forced myself to my feet, heart pounding as I stepped toward the peephole. My breath stalled. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text. Check the camera feed. I hesitated, then slowly opened the security app on my phone. My apartment building had security cameras. One pointed at each hallway, another at the front entrance. I tapped into the hallway feed, and there he was, standing just out of frame. Not in front of my door, just to the side, in the blind spot of the peephole. Waiting? A jagged chill crawled up my spine. I watched as he stood there, motionless, his head tilted slightly toward my door. He knew. He knew I was watching. Then, the sound of police sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. My phone buzzed again. Don't open the door. I didn't. I stepped back, my pulse hammering as I listened to the sirens pull up outside the building. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs. Someone yelled commands. A door slammed open. Then, struggling, shouting. I checked the feed again, my stomach tightening. The man outside my apartment had turned. He was running, but he didn't make it far. 2 officers tackled him to the ground. More shouts, someone yelling, "We got him!" And then, just like that, it was over. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with adrenaline. The next hour was a blur. Cops at my door, questions, reports. They showed me his mugshot. A man in his 40s, hollow eyes, a sick, twisted grin. He had been watching me for months, maybe longer. But that wasn't the worst part. I asked about the first guy, the one they caught breaking into the other apartment. One of the officers shook his head. "We found his body this morning." My blood ran cold. "What?" I whispered. "Dead. Stabbed over a dozen times. Whoever did it, they wanted him gone." I stared at him, my breath coming short. If the first guy was dead, then who the hell had been texting me? Who had warned me? I never found out. The texts stopped. The unknown number was disconnected. The police called it a coincidence. I call it something else. I moved out of state after that. New city, new job, new apartment. Somewhere with no windows facing the street, somewhere where no one knows me. But I still check my phone at night. I still glance at security cameras before opening my door. Because someone out there warned me. Someone out there was watching him too. And I can't help but wonder, what happens when they start watching me again? Photography has never been more than a hobby for me. Some people paint, others play instruments. I take pictures. I like capturing moments that feel empty, frozen in time. Abandoned streets at dawn, forgotten alleyways, train stations just before the last departure of the night. There's something about the stillness that's always pulled me in, like I'm documenting places the world has left behind. I never took pictures of people, not intentionally anyway. I liked my photos to feel untouched, undisturbed, free of human interference. That's why, when I first noticed the man in one of my shots, I barely paid him any mind. It was a picture I had taken near the riverfront, an old cobblestone walkway lined with rusted lampposts. The sky had been a deep shade of navy, the last remnants of daylight barely clinging to the horizon. I had been focused on getting the symmetry right, the way the lampposts cast long, thin shadows stretching toward the water. It wasn't until later, when I was going through my shots, that I noticed the figure standing in the distance. He was near the edge of the frame, half hidden in the gloom beneath a flickering streetlight. A tall man, wearing a hood, his face completely obscured by shadow. His posture was off, rigid, almost unnatural, like he wasn't just passing through but standing there deliberately, watching. I remember staring at the image for a long time, feeling vaguely unsettled but ultimately brushing it off. People ended up in my photos all the time. That's just how it was in a city. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I saw him again. I had spent the day walking through different neighborhoods looking for new angles, fresh places to shoot. That night, as I uploaded the day's shots onto my laptop, something stopped me cold. There he was. Different street, different time of day, same hooded figure standing just out of focus, lingering at the edge of the frame. I felt my stomach tighten. I flipped through the images again, searching, my fingers moving faster. I found another, then another. Every few shoots, there he was. I started combing through my older photos. He was there too. Not always obvious, not always in plain sight, but once I started looking, I couldn't unsee it. Sometimes he was in the background, blending into the crowd. Other times he was more isolated, standing near an alleyway, leaning against a railing, positioned behind a tree just far enough that only half his body was visible. The strangest part, the timeline didn't make sense. The first time I noticed him was weeks ago, but as I dug deeper, I found him in shots from months ago, different seasons, different locations. He had been following me for much longer than I had realized. That night, sleep was out of the question. I sat in my apartment, laptop open, heart pounding as I clicked through years of photos. The earliest one I found was from nearly 2 years ago. I had no explanation. Had he been tracking me all this time? Had I really been that oblivious? I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an odd angle making random passers-by look familiar. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. He was there on purpose. I stopped taking photos for a while. For weeks, my camera collected dust on my desk. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds, checking reflections in windows. But paranoia settled into my bones like an illness. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went shooting again. I told myself I just needed closure. One last night of photos to prove to myself that he wasn't really there, that my paranoia had gotten the better of me. I stuck to busy streets, well-lit areas, places with cameras and people. I avoided isolated alleyways, stayed away from quiet corners where shadows stretched too far, and for a while, it felt normal. But when I got home and plugged in my camera, there was a photo I didn't take. My breath stalled in my chest. It was blurry, poorly framed, like the lens had been lifted and clicked at random, but the subject was unmistakable. It was me. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A photo taken from behind me, somewhere in the crowd while I had been taking pictures. Someone had been standing inches away from me, and I hadn't even known. Panic spread through me in icy waves. I scanned the photo for details, desperate for any clue, the angle, the location. It had been taken no more than an hour before I got home. Whoever took it had been close enough to reach out and touch me. I called the police that night. I told them everything, the photos, the stranger, the realization that he had been following me for years. An officer came by, took a statement, assured me they would look into it. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't take it seriously. No real crime had been committed. No threats, no evidence beyond my own paranoia. I installed extra locks, kept my curtains shut tight, stopped going out at night, and for a few weeks, nothing happened. Then the envelope arrived. It was slipped under my apartment door while I was sleeping. No return address, no markings, just a plain white envelope containing a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from inside my own apartment. I ran straight to the police station, envelope clutched in my shaking hands. This time they listened. Officers arrived at my apartment within minutes. They checked the locks, dusted for prints, reviewed security footage. And this time they found something. The cameras in my building had caught him. A man in a dark hoodie, waiting outside the entrance at 2:46 a.m. He never entered through the front. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, but in one frame he could be seen slipping into the stairwell behind a tenant, walking straight toward my floor. They arrested him a week later. He had been watching me for over 3 years. He lived just a few blocks away, a man I had never met, never spoken to, never noticed in my daily life. But he had noticed me. The police found hundreds of photos in his apartment. Shots of me walking home, sitting in cafes, standing at crosswalks, flipping through books in stores. Some from months ago, some from years ago, and some from inside my apartment while I was sleeping. They asked if I wanted to see them. I said no. I haven't picked up my camera since. Because I know I wasn't the first person he watched, and I won't be the last. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where porch lights flicked on at dusk and kids played outside until their parents called them in for dinner. It was safe. At least, that's what we thought. We had a large backyard, separated from our neighbors by an old wooden fence. Beyond the fence was a dense stretch of trees, too small to be called a forest, but thick enough to feel isolated. As kids, my brother and I would dare each other to run into the woods at night, but we never made it more than a few steps before chickening out. Our house had a small back porch with a single bulb that cast just enough light to reach the edge of the yard. I never thought much about it, until the night I saw him. It was early autumn, I remember, because the leaves had just begun to turn and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell. I was 14 at the time, up late doing homework. My bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and out of habit, I glanced outside. That's when I saw movement near the fence. At first I thought it was an animal, a stray dog, or maybe a deer. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, my stomach tightened. Someone was standing just beyond the fence, deep in the shadows of the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt an icy wave of dread creep up my spine. The figure was tall, its body partially obscured by the branches. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, but I knew I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a tree swaying in the breeze. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. There was a man standing in my backyard. I slowly backed away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to take my eyes off him, afraid that if I looked away he'd suddenly be closer. I forced myself to turn and ran straight to my parents' room. My dad grumbled as I shook him awake, but the moment I told him someone was in the yard, he was out of bed in an instant. He grabbed a baseball bat he kept by the door and stormed onto the back porch, flicking on the light. The yard was empty. No footprints in the grass. No broken branches. Nothing. My parents assured me it was my imagination, that I had been staring at my homework too long, eyes playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw, and that was only the beginning. The next few nights I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there again. And then, on the third night, I did. This time he was closer, standing just inside the yard. I could see him more clearly now. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothing. His face was turned slightly downward, as if he was staring at the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. And then, he took a step forward. The movement snapped me out of my frozen state. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over my chair as I bolted for my parents' room. Again, my dad ran outside, but the man was gone. At this point, my parents were worried, but still skeptical. Maybe it was a neighbor passing through, maybe some teenager messing around. Then, a few nights later, something happened that made them believe me. It was around midnight. My mom had gotten up to get a glass of water. She happened to glance outside and saw the back porch light flicker on. She froze. The light was motion activated. Something had set it off. She nudged my dad awake and he crept toward the window. That's when they saw him. The man was standing at the base of the porch steps. Not at the fence, not by the trees, right up against the house. My mom gasped. The sound must have carried because the man snapped his head upward, looking directly at the window. Then he bolted. My dad threw open the door, but the man had already disappeared into the trees. The police were called. They searched the yard, the woods, even went knocking on our neighbors' doors. No one had seen anything. But the worst part, the back gate was unlocked. We always kept it locked. Always. But that night, it had been unlatched from the inside, as if someone had been inside our yard. The police patrolled the area for a few days, but nothing turned up. And just like that, the man was gone. Or so we thought. Weeks passed. Then months. The weather turned colder, the days shorter, and little by little I started to feel safe again, until the morning we found the footprints. My dad was raking leaves when he noticed them. Deep impressions in the frost-covered grass, leading from the back fence all the way to my bedroom window. Not just once, over and over, like someone had been coming back, night after night, standing outside my window, watching. That was the last straw. My parents installed cameras, replaced the fence, put in floodlights. The police were called again, but there were no suspects, no leads. Whoever he was careful. And just like that, the footprints stopped. We never saw the man again. Years passed. We moved away. My parents never liked talking about what happened, brushing it off as a drifter passing through. But I knew better. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel it. That heavy, sinking dread, that unnerving certainty that someone is watching. I met him when I was 8 years old. At first there was nothing unusual about him, just another kid in the neighborhood. His name was Darren, and he had this quiet, almost still way of carrying himself, like he was always listening but never truly present. We became friends because, at that age, friendship is simple. You live close, you play together, and that's all there is to it. But looking back now, I realize there were signs, things that should have made me run the other way. Like the way he never seemed afraid of anything. Or the way he smiled whenever something got hurt. I remember the first time I saw that look on his face. We were 10, playing in the woods behind my house when Darren spotted a bird with a broken wing. It was small, helpless, twitching on the ground. I wanted to help it, to take it home, maybe tell my mom. Darren just stared. Then, before I could stop him, he picked up a rock and smashed it down. The bird squealed once, then went silent. I froze. Darren, what the hell? He looked at me, tilting his head like I had asked something strange. It was already gonna die. I felt sick. I wanted to run home, to get away from him, but he just stood there, completely unbothered. That should have been the moment I realized something was wrong with him, but I was a kid, and kids don't always understand danger when it's staring them in the face. So I stayed friends with Darren. And over the years, things only got worse. As we got older, Darren's fascination with things he shouldn't do only grew. At first it was little things. Stealing candy from the store, sneaking into places we weren't supposed to be. But there was always something off about the way he did it. He never stole because he wanted something. He stole because he liked the thrill of taking it. He liked knowing he could get away with it, and when he didn't, he never looked guilty. I remember the time he got caught pocketing a lighter at the gas station. The clerk grabbed his wrist, threatened to call the cops, and while I stood there panicked, Darren just stared at him. Not angry, not scared, just watching, like he was waiting to see what the man would do next. The guy let him go with a warning, and as soon as we walked out, Darren smiled. Voila, it was bluffing, he said, like it was a game. Then there was the incident with the neighborhood cat. Fluffy little thing, belonged to this old lady down the street. One day it went missing. Posters went up, people searched, but no one found a trace. Except I did. Or at least, I found Darren sitting behind his garage with a knife, his hands dirty, something half buried in the dirt. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. But I remember the way he looked at me when he noticed I was there. Like he wasn't ashamed, wasn't guilty, just curious about what I'd do next. I wish I had told someone then. Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have gone as far as they did. By the time we hit high school, I started pulling away from Darren. He wasn't just a weird kid anymore, he was dangerous. The way he talked about people was unsettling, like they were nothing more than objects. He could be charming when he wanted to be, though. He had a way of making teachers love him, convincing people to do things for him, making girls think he actually cared about them. But I knew better. I had seen the way he enjoyed hurting things, the way he only ever seemed truly alive when he was causing chaos. I didn't want to be around for whatever he had planned next. And then one night I got a call. It was late, sometime past midnight, and my phone buzzed on my nightstand. I groggily grabbed it, squinting at the screen. It was Darren. He never called. He wasn't the type to need people. Something in my gut told me not to answer, but I did anyway. Hello? My voice was thick with sleep. There was silence for a moment, just static and breathing. Then, in a calm, almost casual tone, he said, "I did something bad." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then, barely above a whisper, "I need your help." I sat up, suddenly wide awake. Every instinct told me to hang up, to not get involved. But Darren had a way of pulling people in, making you feel like you had to do what he wanted. Against my better judgment, I asked, "Where are you?" "Come to the old train tracks, near the woods." Then he hung up. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. I should have gone back to sleep. I should have ignored it. But something about his voice, the calmness of it, unsettled me. I got dressed, grabbed my bike, and rode out. The train tracks were abandoned, stretching through the woods like a forgotten scar. The night was cold, my breath visible in the air as I pedaled faster, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When I got there, Darren was standing near the edge of the trees, hands in his pockets, completely still. The way he stood there, waiting, sent a chill through me. I got off my bike and took a hesitant step forward. "What's going on?" He turned, and that's when I saw it. Behind him, half hidden in the brush, was a body. For the sake of privacy, I won't be using real names. Even now, years later, I don't know if he's still out there. I don't know if he ever got caught. But if he is, I don't want my name tied to any of this. I'll call him Darren. And the person lying in the dirt that night, I won't give them a name at all. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the body. My brain refused to accept what I was looking at. It didn't seem real, the way the limbs were twisted, the way the face was turned just slightly away from me, just enough so I didn't have to look them in the eye. I swallowed hard. "Darren? What did you do?" He tilted his head, watching my reaction with that same eerie curiosity I'd seen in him since we were kids. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. his tone almost casual, like he was talking about a broken toy, not a dead person. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but Darren just sighed. "Look, I didn't call you to freak out. I called you because I need your help." I shook my head. No, I'm not." He took a step closer. I could barely see him in the dim light, but I could feel the weight of his stare. "You are going to help me, unless you want to be just as guilty as I am." My stomach twisted. Guilty. That word clung to me like tar, thick and suffocating. I hadn't done anything, but I was here, wasn't I? I was standing next to a body in the middle of the woods, the only other person around being a guy I had known for years, a guy I had ignored the warning signs about. And just like that, I realized he had planned this. Not the killing, maybe, but calling me, making sure I was involved, making sure I couldn't just walk away. That part was on purpose. I was trapped. My whole body was screaming at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I kept staring at the body, my mind desperately trying to convince itself that this wasn't real, that maybe it was some kind of sick joke, but it wasn't. The air smelled like iron, the dirt beneath the body looked dark and wet, and Darren, if that was even the name I should be using, stood there, watching me, waiting. My voice caught in my throat. "I don't know what you expect me to do." Darren sighed, almost like he was disappointed in me. "I expected you to not be such a little bitch about this." He turned and kicked the dirt near the body, shifting some of the leaves over it. "We need to move it. There's a creek not far from here." That was it. That was the moment I realized he wasn't panicked. He wasn't regretting anything. He was calm. He had already thought this through. I took another step back, feeling my breath quicken. "I'm not helping you." Darren's jaw clenched, but he didn't move toward me. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was analyzing me, running through his next move. That's what always unsettled me about him. He didn't react like a normal person. He calculated. He weighed his options. And right now, I was one of those options. "You really want to go to the cops?" His voice was quiet, almost amused. "You think they'll believe you had nothing to do with it?" I swallowed hard. I hadn't done anything, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. We had been friends for years. I had ignored so many red flags. Who would believe that I just happened to get a call in the middle of the night and showed up next to a dead body with no involvement? I didn't answer. Darren took that as hesitation, and he pounced on it. "I called you first. Your phone's going to show you were here. You ran with me when we used to steal shit as kids. People saw us together all the time. I tell them you were here when it happened? That we planned this together?" He smiled. "I guarantee you they believe me over you." I felt sick. I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Darren had put me in checkmate before I even knew we were playing a game. I had two choices, help him or find a way out. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing in circles. I could feel the sweat building at the back of my neck, my hands clammy and shaking. Darren's words echoed in my head, and for a moment, I truly believed I had no choice. But then something clicked, a sudden sharp clarity, like a light bulb flickering on in the dark. I did have a choice. I could walk away, I could run, I could scream, but I had to do something before this all spiraled further. I swallowed, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm leaving." Darren's eyes narrowed, and I saw something flicker in them. Anger, maybe even a flash of disbelief. He stepped closer to me, but I didn't back down. I met his gaze, and for the first time in years, I didn't flinch. "You think you're just going to walk away from this?" His voice was low, cold. "You're with me or you're against me. That's how this works." I shook my head, my mind racing to find a way out, a way to end this without being caught up in any more of his madness. My fingers fumbled in my pocket, reaching for my phone, the small, hidden device I had switched off earlier because I knew Darren was smart enough to check if I was recording. The minute I pulled it out, though, Darren's eyes locked on it. He lunged toward me, but I was already pressing the emergency 911 button, and before he could grab me, the call connected. "Help!" I shouted, my voice shaky. "I'm with someone. I'm in danger. Please, someone, help!" Darren froze. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He just stared, as if for the first time in his life something was out of his control. It didn't matter. The dispatcher had already heard enough. The sirens came within minutes. I don't know what happened to Darren after that. I was taken to the station where I gave my statement using a fake name for my own safety. The body in the woods was identified and Darren was arrested hours later. There were no charges I could be tied to, no evidence that I had helped him. But I didn't trust the system. I couldn't. I packed up my things soon after and moved away. The memories of Darren, his calm smile, his twisted sense of control, still haunt me. Even now I keep my distance from people like him. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, but more than that, I wonder how many other people he's convinced to do his bidding. Because someone like Darren, he doesn't stop until he gets what he wants.